Hello, everyone. This is Dominique Gomez from the Salazar Center at Colorado State University, and thank you so much for joining us today for this conservation conversation. This series is part of a webinar series we've been hosting for the last couple months. It is a collaboration among university centers in the West. Here we are. 9 different university centers have come together to highlight both the challenges and the solutions in climate change, conservation, and environment. And a little bit more about the series in just a moment. First, just a housekeeping slide. So we would love to hear your questions throughout today. We can't hear from you, but if you submit your questions through that GoToWebinar control panel, we will get to as many questions as we can in the second part of the hour today. This session is being recorded. We will get out a link to everyone who registered within the next 24 hours. We also want to let you know that we would love for you to register for any upcoming webinars at conservationconversations.org. We'll talk a little bit about our next webinar at the very end of the hour today. With that, I want to introduce Dr. Cass Mosley from the University of Oregon, who would talk a little bit about this very important and very timely topic that we're covering in the session. Cass?
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this webinar, Dominique. Sorry, trying to get the video to work. I'm Cass Mosley. I'm the Interim Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Oregon and the Senior Policy Analyst at the Ecosystem Workforce Program. The Ecosystem Workforce Program is a collaborative group that's between the Oregon State University and University of Oregon that's focused on social science research and extension that's really focused on the interface of people and natural resources. And for about 20 years, we've been focused on rural community well-being and natural resource management, particularly in the area of wildfire. So today we're going to spend time, a number of panelists talking about the challenges and policy opportunities and need around wildfire and conservation. And I just want to acknowledge really where we are at this moment. Outside my window, there is, for the second day running, ash raining from the sky. And at the University of Oregon, several hundred of our employees are evacuated from the communities upriver. And this is something that, you know, in the entire West Coast of the US is in a red flag warning. And we know that communities, you know, over the last couple of days, some of them were burned probably to the ground, likely with loss of life. And so this is a particularly challenging moment to be talking about wildfire policy, but it also brings home the incredible urgency of engaging in really tough conversations about how we manage fire, and particularly how we manage fire in the American West. And I just want to also point out, as we're thinking about policy solutions over the course of the next hour, that these fires that are burning right now in Western Oregon and Western Washington are primarily not in landscapes where we see a lot of fire. The fire return intervals are very long, and some of the most obvious and talked about management approaches, such as thinning, would probably not change the fire behavior of these fires. And so that, I think, is a call to action, to think about the role of climate change, to think about the role of community preparation and planning for those bad days. And I just also want to really acknowledge, before I introduce Tony Chang, the firefighters, the first responders who are really battling fires in the time of COVID, and know that this is something that we are, as a community, I'm incredibly thankful for that dedication and that heroism. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from brief presentations from 3 panelists, and then our goal here is to have lots of time for you all to ask questions, so that we can, and I have some questions that I have for these panelists as well, so we really can have a robust dialogue about these tricky issues. So Tony Chang, Dr. Tony Chang, is the director of the Colorado Forestry Research Institute and a professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University. His primary research is in forest governance and policy, with a focus on collaborative approaches that promote resilient forests and communities. As the director of CFRI, Tony oversees programs to achieve forest restoration and wildfire hazard reduction goals. He was born and raised in Washington's Palouse country, and he has a PhD in forestry from Oregon State University. So Tony, I'll let you take it away from here.
Great, thank you, Cass. And thanks for that introduction. About 2 days ago, we had ash raining down here in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I'm at Colorado State University. And then 24 hours later, we received snow. And so if that is not kind of an encapsulation of the kind of climate change induced things that are happening, I don't know what is. Well, I wanted to lay the groundwork for our discussion today by presenting three challenges, policy challenges in wildfire policy, governance, management that have really been vexing, especially over the last 20 or so years, when we have really seen this increase in wildfire size, severity, and frequency. But before I start out, I want to orient folks to the kind of landscape that we're dealing with that makes it so challenging, and it's large part a manifestation of the land ownerships and the jurisdictions across the Western U.S. Where about half of the land is owned and managed by federal government agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Department of Defense. About 14% of that is managed by state government, and then the rest is in private hands through a variety of large, small NGOs. So it's a really puzzle piece, intermingled kind of jumble of land ownerships, which contributes to a lot of the challenges in wildfire policy and management. So next. So the first challenge is to orient people to the idea that wildfire is a paradox. It poses a policy paradox. Wildfire is simultaneously a natural, necessary, and oftentimes beneficial force. And so we have policies and mandates and missions of many of our agencies that oversee wildland fire to think about and manage fire in a way that promotes its use and its operation on the landscape. But we also recognize that, especially today, it's an extremely dangerous, disruptive and destructive force. So as such, fire is very fuzzy and ill-defined problem. And this poses a policy challenge because an essential characteristic of any good policy, political scientists and public administration people will tell you that one attribute of a good policy is that it's a clearly defined, framed, and tractable problem that then can have corresponding clear, tractable solutions. So on the one hand, we have a variety of policy trajectories and programs and institutions that treats fire as a completely negative force, that and a manifestation is that is throwing all kinds of resources, equipment, and human beings in front of flames in order to squelch them and put them out. And on the other, we also have policies, especially in federal land agencies, that allow for different ways to manage fire and fire risk. Because it's an ill-defined and policy and much varied across these ownerships, policymakers and managers are left to their own discretion interpretation, and therefore the right answer is elusive. So we have not settled on a society and as a set of policy institution about under what conditions and what ways do we treat fire differently. And this article here that I just showed is a really good encapsulation of that. So the second here is that the authority and responsibility for wildland fire management is distributed across different jurisdictions and levels of government. And so here on the left here, you see a map of my home county, Larimer County, with Fort Collins in the middle, and all the different colored squares and splotches our different land ownerships and jurisdictions. And kind of right in the middle is in kind of a light orange color is the High Park fire that burned in 2012. And then to the left of that will be the current fire that we have right now called Cameron Peaks. And as you can see, that fire and many other fire footprints have burned across these land ownerships and jurisdictions. So fire response and management involves many different actors and organizations, and all of them have their own missions, mandates, values, capacities, budgets, and cultures, ways of doing business. So this has resulted in a diffuse and fragmented institutional landscape. And this is a challenge because wildfires obviously don't comply with land ownership boundaries and jurisdictions. And wildfire response and management requires quite a bit of cooperative, coordinated, collective action. But right now, there's a lack of policies and institutional frameworks to make this collection of action happen. Next. And the last challenge I'll leave you with for the rest of the panel to take on is that the past is a poor guide for the future. How we've managed fire in the past, what we even understand about how fire has operated ecologically through a variety of historical ecology and science, really is insufficient for informing what to do in the future. So for one, historically, compared to today we have much more persistent and diverse and dispersed land use and development. And with that, many more ignition sources on the land. So our human incursion into fire-prone areas has been greatly expanding. Climatic changes, I think we're going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about this, and I know it's a fairly consistent theme through this entire series. There's plenty of documented evidence and research now that recent and forecasted future climate changes are going to increase wildfire frequency, size, and severity, as well as the length of the fire season. We're now seeing it's not uncommon for northern hemisphere countries to experience fires year-round now. The ecosystems that once were adapted to wildfire, that regenerated from fire, they're not recovering from those fires like they used to. The far left article by one of my colleagues here at CSU, among many others, are finding that vegetation and those ecosystem attributes are not recovering from fire. And then the last is that as we're seeing the loss and conversion of vegetation types, we're seeing kind of some feedback loops potentially where forests that are fairly abundant sequesters of atmospheric carbon are now releasing that carbon into the atmosphere and not holding those carbon reserves anymore. And so in many ways, the ways in which we think about and respond and manage fire have really not been part of a future forward climate solution policy dialogue thus far. So we have no frame of reference at this point for any kind of policy learning. And so the hope is that we can start initiating those conversations today.
Thank you, Tony. Let me now turn it to Emily Jane Davis, who will talk a little bit about private lands in managing fire in private lands. Emily Jane is an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University and the associate director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program. She analyzes natural resource collaboration, wildfire, public lands policy, and rural community development. She also provides technical assistance and support to a variety of collaborative and partnership efforts in natural resource management. Dr. Davis holds a PhD in geography from the University of British Columbia. Thanks, Emily Jane. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Cass. Thank you all for being here. Before I start, I actually wanted to acknowledge something else that's happening today. Some academics in the US and Canada are actually on a public teach-in strike today. This was called by Anthea Butler, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and asks those faculty and students who are able to use their time that they would spend teaching instead to speak about the urgent importance of addressing racism and injustice in the US. Oregon State University's Graduate Student Council in my College of Forestry asked us to participate or support the effort as we were able today. So I'd just like to share this with you, honor this request, even though this is a very small gesture, by letting you know about these hashtags on and these websites where you can find quite a bit of resources. So as Cass said, I'll be speaking about the role of private lands in this incredibly intermixed and complex landscape that Tony set the stage for. Although, as we saw, federal agencies manage the majority of the lands in most Western states, private forest and range landowners are a really important part of that picture as well. The American Forest Foundation, for example, noted that in California, nearly 3 of every 5 acres at risk in important watersheds are privately owned. And the word private itself also covers a really vast category of types of land and types of ownership, from hundreds of thousands of acres that might be owned by corporate ranches or timber investment entities to very small parcels owned by individuals or families. It's also worth noting that the landowner population, while it does vary, it isn't equitably reflective of the US population. So family forest landowners are predominantly male, white, and non-Hispanic in comparison to the demographics of the general US population. And this is from the National Woodland Owner Survey that the Forest Service runs. You know, some of this private land, like we see here, is large contiguous tracts, many hundreds or thousands of acres owned by one landowner. Some of its inholdings are small pieces tucked within a national forest or park. Some is really highly checkerboarded or interspersed. And then private landowners might have really different management objectives or missions for their land, even across a fence line. Many of them may never even coordinate or speak to each other. So what this means is, even though there's a lot of physical interface between these land ownerships, there isn't always a human connection there, social or institutional networks that would facilitate cross-boundary management. And so that means that private lands pose both a potential conservation asset and risk when we think about wildfire across the landscape. So a common narrative about wildfire and private lands that is unfortunately too real today here is that it's destructive. It threatens homes, it threatens and destroys timber, cattle, other values that landowners may be having their lands for. In the course of my research as a primarily qualitative researcher, I have sat with people in tears talking about the loss of their homes or their crops or their timber. And that's what's happening right now. So I want to acknowledge that pain. I also want to acknowledge 3 specific ways that fire can also foster opportunities for conservation and stronger interconnection across private forest and rangelands and in the larger landscape. First is the inescapable fact that wildfire is a manifestation of climate change that's very real for private landowners. Wildfire and drought are topics that, depending on the landscape they're located in, are very concerning to them. They're willing to talk about it and they want to take actions to address it. Many are motivated to thin their forest land, for example, to reduce the risk of fire. In doing so, they might also create co-benefits for forest restoration and resiliency and help bring that stand back to some better ecological condition for other disturbances and for more future climate change. Fire also increasingly motivates landowners to participate in cross-boundary projects and programs, landscape scale cross-boundary wildfire risk reduction efforts like those we see funded through the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Program of the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. You know, second, there's many landowners in both forest and rangeland settings who recognize the natural and historic role of fire in creating and maintaining the ecosystems in which they own that land. They want to use controlled, prescribed fire when safe and effective to actually reduce future wildfire risk. They want to restore desirable understory communities and wildlife habitat. And some of you probably know that elsewhere in the US, such as the Southeast and the Southern Midwest, there's a very strong fire culture where private landowners are able to burn their land and even come together and prescribe burn associations to share equipment and resources for doing so across each other's boundaries. In the West, we have some landowner interest in that same approach. We have limited implementation as we face a lack of enabling conditions. And those include smoke permitting, liability, training, and the availability of qualified personnel to conduct and particularly lead prescribed fires as burn bosses. A third way in which wildfire provides an opportunity for conservation and connection is how it's created the opportunity for collective action around suppressing rangeland wildfires. In Oregon and Idaho, there are numerous rangeland fire protection associations that train and empower ranchers to respond to fires on and across millions of acres of private, state, and federal land. The motto of these RFPAs is neighbors helping neighbors, and they bring together not only those rancher neighbors, but ranchers in the Bureau of Land Management and federal government entities, and create an environment where they're working for a common cause, often lessening tensions between them. The work of these entities is also closely tied to wildlife conservation, as the greater sage grouse, for example, depends on limiting the extent of large destructive fires to maintain its habitat. RFPA members and their government partners often like to point out that you don't hear about them much because they put the fires out before they can make the news. I'd just like to finish my part of this discussion here by pointing to some potential policy solutions that will help private land continue to be a conservation asset in the face of wildfire. First is the need to continue to fully fund the landowner conservation and stewardship programs that are available to allow landowners to do this work and make it possible for them, including programs that are administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Farm Service Agency, and Bureau of Land Management. Access to these programs is particularly important for landowners within cross-boundary settings because they can contribute to strategic puzzle pieces in larger landscapes that might be funded by also important programs such as the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Program. Second, there are programs that can support landowner suppression and prescribed fire capacity so that this can be done safely. These include the Volunteer Fire Assistance Program, helping provide equipment and training to entities like the RFPAs, and efforts like the Fire Learning Network, which combines funding from multiple agencies to support communities of practice and learning around wildfire and prescribed fire. Finally, we also need to address barriers to the widespread safe implementation of prescribed fire in Western states. And although the really substantial issues with liability will have to be addressed in state-by-state policy arenas, there's research by some of my colleagues, Heidi Huber-Stearns, Courtney Schultz, and Sarah McCaffrey, which suggests that there's still outstanding needs for training, for resources, and incentives for increasing prescribed fire that could be more deeply supported by federal agency leadership and directives. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the role of private lands in the wildfire conservation landscape. And I'm going to turn it back to Cass now to introduce Tyson, who will be elaborating on some of the policy and administrative change opportunities.
Thank you, Emily Jane. That was really great. And I just want to acknowledge the beautiful pictures. Probably this photography was taken entirely by you, but we can always count on Emily Jane to be providing beauty whenever we're talking. So let me introduce Tyson. Tyson Biggerton Riggs. Sorry, I knew I was going to blow that. Tyson, apologies.
No worries,
This is a policy, every time, right? Policy analyst with Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, where he focuses on federal land management policy, particularly related to the U.S. Forest Service. In addition to providing policy analysis, tracking, and engagement with the coalition, he is an author of the Understanding Good Neighbor Authority, a guidebook to help practitioners understand the evolving use and practice of the Good Neighbor Authority. And he, is also many other of these kinds of resources that he and the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition has been creating over the last several years have been really invaluable. Tyson also holds a Master's of Forestry in Forest Policy from Oregon State University. Tyson, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. So, I feel like I'm really sort of picking up on what Tony had shared and what EJ had shared. As Tony said, when you look at the Western US, the single largest landowner is federal government. All focus mostly on federal policy, but as EJ said, there's also a huge private lands component of this, and I would say in terms of policy itself, that also has a significant nexus with federal agencies as well as with state agencies, of course. All focus mostly on national forest system as a landowner, but don't want to gloss over the need for larger policy reform in these other spaces as well. So a couple of items to help guide some of the conversation and the questions that'll come afterwards. I really want to make it plain and say this out loud, that I think the scientific consensus is that there is no future of conservation in the West that doesn't involve the reintroduction of fire. And I say that with a great amount of sensitivity given what's happening in my own community here and across the West. But I also want to point out that this reintroduction of fire is not just a question of conservation value, but also really of reducing fire risk and reducing fire severity in places that we really want to see that happen. So be suspicious of any solutions, policy solutions that don't point towards fire as being a component of that. And as Cass said at the introduction, it's also worth noting the limitations of our own experience and understanding. Some of the fires that are happening now in Western Oregon are not the sort of thing that a lot of the policies that we have circulating now or policy proposals might really address. So we are living in a time of uncertainty and climate change, as all of the speakers have noted so far. So I think my big point that I want to point out here is just that the current policies and practices and culture of the federal agencies that are really responsible for managing fire are not currently aligned in a way that promotes the use of fire, right? So whether that's through managed wildfire or through additional prescribed fire, I think that's the big policy challenge that's in front of us, is how do we build managing fire, using fire into these agencies? I think it's worth noting here as well that a lot of times when we think about these sorts of agency culture change or changes in agencies, we often speak of it in terms of culture. Tony noted that there are a lot of individual efforts and leaders within this space that have done innovative things, and that's great. But I would say that policy itself sort of acts as a bit of an invisible landscape underneath the actual landscape that has its own peaks and valleys and its own resistance or ease of moving in different directions. And I think ultimately, until we change that policy landscape, we can see individual brave efforts at trying different management, but it's always sort of fighting uphill to do something that the agencies are not currently bureaucratically really built to do. So what does this kind of reform look like, particularly for the Forest Service and National Forest Service system? Well, I think it comes down to three major things. I think right now what we're seeing is that there is a significant lack of funding to achieve this kind of fire risk reduction work that we need to have. There's an old model within the Forest Service, particularly embedded within the bureaucracy, that trees equal money. And while that may be true in some locations, that's generally inversely related to the level of fire risk. And so I think we should recognize that just like any pre-disaster mitigation, this work will require funding. Second, I'd say that the Forest Service system currently is really focused on annual outputs, and that tends to create a perverse incentive to go after easy acres to meet these things on an annual basis when you might be able to do more in 1 year, but an agency or an administrative unit of it doesn't, in order to hold back and try to meet those annual output targets for the next year. So I think the next challenge in front of us is really overhauling that annual output approach. Recognizing that annual outputs are, even those that are sort of meeting the values that a lot of people have, maybe poor proxies for ways to get there. And then finally, I think we need to look at changes to staffing for most major agencies. We've all talked about climate change to some degree, and I think that only puts a finer point on the need for changing staffing structures. We currently have a fire suppression model that's based essentially on seasonal employment. Often the idea is that you have college kids that are there for 3.5 months in between terms of school. That's no longer really a staffing model that meets the needs in front of us. Not only is the fire season longer, but we really have this need to do proactive fire risk reduction work, even when fires aren't actively burning. And so I think reevaluation of staffing and training is a huge component of the work in front of us. But not to end it on a doom and gloom note, I think we do have a lot of opportunities in front of us. There are both opportunities in terms of the sort of political momentum of seeing change, and there are also opportunities for the way that change can be more inclusive than the way that we currently manage. For the political opportunities, unfortunately, when we do see disasters, there is more awareness of the problem at hand. And I think particularly with climate change, it's harder and harder to ignore this need for policy reform. I think we also have an opportunity, unfortunately, with COVID and stimulus spending. It's a good chance to, again, get out in front of the needed money to do some of this risk reduction work. And then in terms of real opportunities to be more expansive in the way that we think about these policy changes, there's a real opportunity for economic growth and benefit to rural communities as we think about this. There's also, I think, an equity issue in the way that we think about reshaping these policies. And I think we'll get to that probably with some of the Q&A. But we can change the way that we think about this as applying only to wealthier landowners. We can also think about this as being a matter of creating quality jobs and not merely doing the work for the lowest cost possible. So I think I'll pause there and we can move to the Q&A portion.
Thank you, Tyson. So at this point, we're going to open it to questions here. Please type your questions in the questions section, and we will. I will sort of be navigating, managing those questions along with Dominique, our host. And while people are typing their thoughts, Tyson, I'm going to point out that your mic is bumping up against your button and it is creating lots of noise for the rest of us. So anyway, I think we were like, everybody thought we were all on mute, but I think that's what it is. So as people are thinking about questions, let me ask a couple of my own here that I really spoke to me. And as you know, as we were talking, I think that the things that came through for me is the many paradoxes and contradictory challenges that Tony raises of simultaneously having policies that just try to have more fire and policies that try to have less fire. And we have policies that try to attend to climate change and policies that try not to attend to climate change. And we have, you know, so we're in this sort of constant cycle of contradiction. And yet somehow I think I don't mean to suggest that there aren't a lot of solutions out there. I do think we heard from EJ and Tyson about solutions. I think the collaboration and partnerships across boundaries are powerful and critical. The importance of investing resources and personnel and money and in landowners are really critical. And taking seriously the agency capacity issues. You know, we've really seen as fire has overwhelmed the land management agencies at the moment of actually flat or declining budgets, means that for 25 years we've seen a decline in the land management capacity of the federal land management agencies, and that those are real policy challenges that need attention. So let me, with that, dive into a couple of questions for folks. So, you know, Tyson, I think maybe you could start off to really think through or talk a little bit more about how you think about long-term funding needs. I mean, we obviously saw the fire funding fix happen, you know, and really beginning to come into play in this year, but we know that is not a long-term solution. So could you talk a little bit about where we think the funding outlook is going to be and where we need it to be to make progress in this space?
Great, yeah. Well, I think starting with where it may be, it is encouraging to see that I think there's an awareness that there's real investment that's needed in this work. And so I think that conversation is happening in Congress. We've seen a number of proposals that have come out so far unsuccessfully as COVID stimulus that have focused on additional funding for forest restoration and fire resiliency. So that's great to see, but in terms of where it needs to be, you know, we're really probably talking about a billions of dollars problem here. Obviously, we will probably have to prioritize where we do this work across the landscape, and that's its own issue. So, you know, it may very well be at this point that we're playing a bit of a game of triage, but more money is better, I suppose.
Thank you. So let me turn to one of the questions that we have received in the chat. And Tony, this might be for you, but I actually defer to whoever may want. Oh dear, the questions are coming in so quickly I can't keep up. So one of the questions we had is to really talk about the role of the cohesive strategy and what role it's playing in potentially organizing folks across land ownerships, across multiple scales in government. Can you, Tony, talk a little bit about what role there is, and if you have any policy recommendations around the cohesive strategy, that would be great to hear those as well.
Yeah, so for I guess listeners that aren't familiar with the cohesive strategy, it was a mandate that came along with from Congress to deal with some of the fire borrowing and fire suppression funding fixes, and it really kind of piles on top of the federal land and fire agencies a need to have a much more cohesive and coherent approach to dealing with fire and fire risk along three dimensions. One is kind of a more strategic and intentional approach to fire suppression. A second is to restore fire adapted and resilient landscapes. And the third is around creating and fostering more fire adapted communities and community preparedness. I think the strategy itself sort of sits on top of a movement that's already happening in a lot of places locally. So, you know, I follow the Western region's cohesive strategy. There's kind of an organizing committee, and they have a whole range of stories and those kinds of things that really highlight ways in which local communities and partners have banded together to deal with one or more of those three dimensions of the strategy. I think where the strategy, you know, kind of makes, at least locally here in Region 2 of the Forest Service and in Colorado, where the strategy is playing out is where there's already a fair amount of resources and capacity among state, local, and non-governmental organizations that are already working together on things like forest landscape restoration, fire adapted communities, and community wildfire protection plans. I think what we see is there's already a lot of movement happening in certain areas, but it's certainly not well distributed across areas that are even at the highest risk. And so I think one thing to pay attention to with the cohesive strategy is that it didn't really come with a lot of resources and other authorities. It was more of an idea and a principle, and to really make it sort of stick, I guess, and to make it more institutionalized, I think there was still a large reliance on federal agencies to provide funding and support for a lot of these local scale efforts. I think from my perspective, I think communities, local governments, and the states need to kind of put more skin in the game in terms of, especially on the community preparedness side, land use planning, you know, kind of the mitigation and fuels reduction work. And there's a lot of work to be done in terms of building that local and state level capacity for just a broader range of wildland fire management strategies than just suppression. Most of those entities, they're full suppression because they kind of have to be, because they can't let fires get any bigger than they do. So there's a lot of things that need investment, like Tyson said.
Great, thanks. So let me connect a couple of dots between and move to a different topic here. One of the questions that we have, I'm reminded of actually connecting where I began my remarks with the fact that we're in a moment where there are thousands of firefighters out on the lines, and Emily Jane's point about you know, racism and anti-racism, to just raise a point about thinking about and talking about explicitly who does the work of fighting fire and doing forest restoration. And I think we have the stereotype of what a forest worker or a firefighter is, and increasingly that is not accurate. And so I wanted Emily Jane to maybe start a little bit and talk through both the workforce who does the work of firefighting and forest work looks like, and how we might think about addressing issues of racism in that workforce.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that, Cass. So for those of you who aren't aware, much of the work to reduce fuels, so to remove fuels from the forest in preparation for fire, is labor intensive. It involves clearing brush and trees that are too small to be sold for timber value. And so many of the workers performing that work, or the logging or the firefighting, are part of a Latinx workforce that, varies in quite a bit. Some folks are temporarily here, some have been here for generations. And a challenge that we have is that they face often unsafe working conditions, such as low wages, dangerous working conditions. And part of this is challenged by the contracting system of the federal government. So when contracts are awarded considering best value to the government, that often can mean the lowest price, which can mean some of that low price goes to the workers. To address that, there's two major factors in this. One is a lack of labor law enforcement, and the other is a lack of resources to support forest workers. And I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more about this to go look at the work of the Northwest Forest Worker Center, which for decades has been working on these issues, advocating specifically for stronger labor law enforcement and for creating resources for workers through their Promotoria community health program. I guess I would also suggest really to all of us, when the leadership of land management agencies talks about increasing the pace and scale of restoration to prepare for fires and doing more acres, they talk about shared stewardship, any of their current initiatives, that we need to continue to assert that this conversation has to include the voices of forest workers and their advocates. And we also always have to keep us inserting the question of, well, who's doing this work and under what conditions, not just how many acres can we check off.
Thanks, EJ. And so, Tyson, I mentioned that you, that one of the things you've been working on over the last couple of years is Good Neighbor Authority. And so we have a question about Good Neighbor Authority. And so I was hoping that you could tell the audience what Good Neighbor Authority is, and then talk about how folks might be using it to reduce fire hazard in some states.
Perfect. Yeah, and apologies if I missed a little section there. My internet connection seemed to fail. I actually want to address something about the last question, and then I'll move to Good Neighbor. But I think as we think about places in terms of sort of low-hanging fruit for changing the nature of the work, the quality of the work, and social justice generally, I think one of the places we should start is by looking at prison labor on fire suppression. Currently, there's no pathway for a lot of people who are essentially doing that work unpaid now to find paid employment after. Yet we know that this is a workforce that we really need to be expanding right now. So I just offer that up as an easy place to start for some of that. For Good Neighbor specifically, though, so Good Neighbor, really high level, it's a tool that allows partnership.
All right, it looks like we might have lost Tyson's internet connection. Should I move on, or Emily, Jane, do you want to talk about Good Neighbor Authority? Should I move on to a different question?
You can move on to a different question.
Okay.
If Tyson comes back, he can have that.
Great. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you a little bit about is you talked a little bit about the rangeland protection associations and how they are sort of a helping neighbor approach. And I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about whether you think that model is transferable to other landscapes at all, and if so, what might be some of the lessons learned that could go into other places. And Tyson, it looks like you're back. I'll come back to you in a second.
Sure, I'll keep this brief to make space for Tyson, but a similar model that's practiced in the Midwest is the Prescribed Burn Association that I mentioned, where landowners come together and share resources and help each other burn. So that's a really different context than Oregon or Idaho. What makes it transferable, I think, or contexts in which it would be most likely to be transferable, is it really depends on that knowledge of the ranchers, their presence on the land, and their local knowledge about areas that are remote from other fire responders, and that, where is that tree track, where's that road, where's that cliff, where's that water source. So it's a good fit for a place where you have ranchers on the ground, where they're motivated to work and work together, and where they have local knowledge to contribute. You need a supportive framework, enabling legislation from the state government, and you need to have cooperative agreements in place to ensure that RFPAs are going to function safely and cooperatively with government fire responders.
Great, thanks. So Tyson, can you take another swing at the Good Neighbor Authority while we've got your internet connected?
Sure thing. Yeah, apologies again. So Good Neighbor, short version is that it allows state agencies to work as partners with federal agencies in land management. That can mean a lot of different things. It can mean that federal appropriated dollars go to pay for a state forestry agency to conduct, say, pre-commercial thinning. It can also mean that a state actually steps in and administers a timber sale, so long as it's for the purposes of restoration, and utilizes that timber revenue to do additional work on the ground. There's a lot of potential there, but I would flag a couple of limitations. One thing is that there's no free lunch. Any sort of work still requires additional staff. So if you really want to see an increase in the amount of restoration that's happening, even if it's done largely boots on the ground by a state agency, it still requires grants and agreement staff within the federal agency to really be able to move those partnerships forward. I think we're also at a really critical juncture right now with state budgets taking a huge hit due to the COVID recession, which will make it harder for state agencies to put forward the personnel that are really needed to do this work. So a lot of potential there, but certainly some limitations, and maybe the most of which is that it sort of doubles down on a commodity production model of forestry, where you're really looking for the revenue in the trees in order to do the additional restoration, which again, may play out on some locations, but is probably inversely related to fire risk reduction.
Tony, do you want to add in on anything there, particularly your different landscape of Colorado and how Good Neighbor might play differently there than in a more higher landscape like Oregon where there's higher value trees?
Yeah, well, I think especially in the wildland urban interface where you have that wide, much more expanding ground of development into the fire-prone areas. I think we're get to see some areas where you can make a difference in terms of modifying fire behavior by having larger treatments go deeper into that federal landscape. So I think I think that's probably where the biggest gains can be made, but it doesn't change the economics of it. In fact, it might make the economics may even make it more costly, but might have some longer term benefits in terms of risk reduction. But that's kind of where there may be some more gains. I think there still is another incentive that's driving that, which is that timber production part of it, where we're seeing a lot more efforts to be made on that side as well.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple of pretty high level questions that are in the chat, and so let me pose them and really open it to any of you. One of them is about climate change and fire policy, and ask the question, how might we think about the way we create policy so that we can deal with the constantly changing climate and therefore vegetation and this much more dynamic social ecological system that we're living in? How do we think about policy differently? Is there some, Tony started our whole conversation with a good policy depends on a good problem definition. What if the world is changing so fast that there's no good problem definition? So how do we, I'm sorry to be slightly academic in my question, but how do we think about 21st century conservation and fire policy given the dynamics we're seeing? And I throw it open to either any of you to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I guess one, there's just kind of looking at what some of the current conversations are. One is we have what's called the Trillion Tree Initiative, right? So sort of one way that of dealing with the climate is that, well, trees sequester carbon, so let's put more trees in the ground. I can tell you, like, in 100 years, you're going to have even, kind of worse forest fire situations than you are now, and so that may not be the best investment. I think we just even need to start having conversations where forests, fire, and climate become kind of the legs of a stool of some kind of climate oriented policy dialogue. Thus far, they've really been kind of separate. from a national forest policy standpoint, a lot of the guidance to especially like the U.S. Forest Service and even at the state level is really just kind of just that. They're kind of guidance, even during the Obama administration, where you had guidance from the CEQ to federal agencies. It was still very kind of soft and suggestive, and it didn't really, I think, capitalize on a lot of the new evolving science, as well as some of the management thinking that I think we can have now. And so I think that we often kind of try to kind of distill the climate and forest and fire into like a one silver bullet thing. Well, we just need more trees in order to sequester more carbon. Well, that creates these other unintended consequences of potential future fire and those kinds of things that's going to release even more carbon. So how do I mean, I think it's okay to be play with more nuanced and complex policy thinking and take a much more experimental and policy learning approach than just kind of like having the solution, laying it down, and then walking away from it.
Thank you, and I apologize for everybody who's getting to witness my cats. My kitties have just decided that they have to be petted right at this minute. They won't leave. So Tyson, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, just a little bit. They're adorable, so no complaints. I think there are two components of making good on what Tony just offered there, and one of that is funding for science and monitoring, and the other is creating the performance measures that actually allow the agency to be rewarded for taking that kind of innovative management approach. So continuing funding for basic science as well as for monitoring on projects specifically, I think is really critical to being able to be adaptive to changing conditions. And then we also need to have a performance measure system that is actually rewarding the agency for doing that, as opposed to, again, looking for these annual outputs and prioritizing that over longer term planning.
Thank you. Sorry, the cats are really completely out of control. Okay, so we had this is a question actually for EJ and then Tony as to scientists. We had an interesting question about how science gets incorporated into collaborative approaches, and I know both of you are both scholars who incorporate your own science into collaboration and have both studied the role of science and collaboration. Wanted you to weigh in a little bit about how that works in practice and what we might take away from that in a policy perspective. EJ, I'll start with you.
Sure. So yeah, science has actually been a really important motivator for many collaborative groups, at least in Oregon and the Northwest. The idea that of joint fact finding, getting together to review what's known about a problem, and then combining that with considerations of the different values that people have in order to make sort of a science-based decision. I think that we've seen some really great instances where scientists have worked directly with collaborative groups and forest managers to do that kind of science, say to learn about a fire history and then use that to develop ideas for how they want to work on an area. Some of the challenges that do come up are, the scientific process and the collaborative process run on different timescales, have different incentives, et cetera. Another is that there can be science duels or different types of science being brought in, or just, and it's really, really hard because not all science gives you all answers all the time, and oftentimes there is not site-specific, highly local information. So I think something that all of us have to get better at doing is facing uncertainty. There won't always be an answer. Scientists themselves usually don't promise that they have an answer. They may be able to tell you under certain conditions this may happen. And so thinking about how we can have more uncertainty and adaptive management and learning would be ideal. Tony?
Yeah, this is a great question and something that I feel like I live and try to deal with all the time. I think one starting point is really about the institution of science. One trend that I see at least in academia is just almost there's always been a bifurcation and a wall between especially on the academic science and research side and the world of practice, land-grant universities like mine and Emily Jane's and others, try to bridge that. But even so, there's such a strong incentive and driver to build up your H index. And for non-academics, it's basically a measure of how many times you've been cited, how many times your papers have been cited, which becomes a very important metric for your promotion and tenure and all the performance rewards in academia. And so, working with collaborative groups, working with managers and policymakers, they don't build your H index. And so that there's sort of an embedded incentive within science as an institution that is moving scientists and science away from that interaction and engagement with collaboration and policy. On the other hand, you do have institutions in academia and other research entities like Extension, Cooperative Extension. I run an organization, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, for whom our mission is to be the bridge and boundary spanner between science and practice and management. But that isn't a very widely distributed model at this point. And so I think if there is a benefit and need for kind of this increase in boundary spanning, bridging organizations that can really build to strengthen that linkage between science and scientists to the people that really need that capability for problem solving, then kind of part of that investment problem that Tyson brought up, that's got to be a part of that solution is to have that rather than that's oftentimes one of the first things that gets cut at universities.
Thanks. So we're just a few minutes from time, and I want to give Dominique a chance at the end to talk about the next webinar session. So I wanted to sort of give a round robin, quick final last licks. If you were found yourself in an elevator with the Undersecretary for Natural Resources for the next administration in February of 2021, what one thing would you ask them to do? Tyson?
Sure. Well, just one small thing, I suppose. It's begin to undertake a complete overhaul of public lands management. And that may mean the enabling legislation, and it also may mean a look at the bureaucracy underlying it. It's a huge task in front of us, but I think it's one that we actually need to start.
Tony?
I think exhibiting, using that bully pulpit to really engage governors and state forestry leaders, state level forestry and fire leaders, and really bringing that conversation to a broader network of people and participants.
Great, thank you. Emily Jane.
Look at performance measures and targets and how those drive land management agencies' actions from the very base.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank everybody for spending their hour with us. This has been a really productive conversation, I hope, for all of you. I know there were many more questions in the chat than we could possibly have gotten to. Some of them really profound and hard to do. We could go another hour. So, but let me hand it over to Dominique to talk about the next upcoming webinar, that conservation conversation that's coming up in September.
Thank you so much, Cass. And yes, thank you all of you. I think this was such an important topic today, and really appreciated all your comments on what's going on in the American West, and thoughts for families and people affected, and all the firefighters and others. We also want to make sure to thank Heidi Huber-Stearns, who's the director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program, and who helped set up the great webinar and session today. Also want to just let you know, next 2 weeks from now, Thursday, September 24th, we'll be having our next conservation conversation. It will be hosted by the Andrus Institute, and it will be about transboundary conservation, migration, and fragmentation across conservation landscapes. We know it will be a great session. You can sign up for it and learn about our next couple conversations at conservationconversations.org. With that, thank you all so much for joining us today. We will send out the recording in the next couple days. Be safe, and thank you. Bye.